Hi there, I'm Timothy Linsdau, video producer and Christian. Put my science cap on again today with the story about the space race and getting to the moon. This month on PBS and other stations are doing multiple documentaries on this history and how amazing it all was. Now, before we start, like and comment on my video, subscribe to my channel if you would to support my channel. Thank you. Okay, now, some of the things I learned, or relearned, things I'd forgotten, and one of them was how the military and others in the very beginning of America's space race were pretty much not interested in the space. They didn't comprehend what it would take, what we would accomplish, and they really thought it was a Buck Rogers idea, if you will. In other words, a fantasy. And amazingly, though, we, the Americans at the end of World War II, had captured the best of the German scientists that had built the rockets at the end of the war that they were lobbing on England towards the end of the war. Of course, Wernher von Braun was the leading scientist that we were able to get a hold of, and quite a few of the people that had worked for him. And the documentary I saw said that the Soviets got quite a few, but they were second rate compared to the ones we got. But interestingly enough, based on that being second rate, they were ahead of the U.S. by quite a bit in the 50s. Apparently the U.S. only real concern, it was in rocketry for weapons and designing ways to lob an atomic bomb at our enemies. And the idea of actually traveling in space, going to the moon, was not a critical issue until 1957, when the Russians put up the Sputnik. And it was such a shock to them. It seems odd with the CIA and all that. They didn't know what was going on. And so the Russians were immediately ahead in this jump forward in technology. And of course, it created a lot of fear. You know, what can we do? How do we catch up? And all that whatnot. And suddenly, all of a sudden, they're talking money and budgets and what do we got to do to get up to speed? And probably meeting with Wernher von Braun, who had already told the U.S. In the planning stages that you should put a satellite up and let's get going with this idea of being in space. In fact, part of von Braun's plans to go to the moon involved a space station, one of those big circle like a donut space stations orbiting the Earth. I mean, what a huge project it would have been just to get to the moon from what they finally did do. Now, they sent up a lot of this kind of surprised me. The Ranger series, I barely remember that. There was NASA started sending up missions that really, they weren't to land. They were just to film the moon as long as they could until it crashed right into the moon, just bang. And in fact, I remember seeing those, and you just see the moon getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and poof. Well, that went on for a while, and they continued to do that until they could finally get on the surface of the moon. But at the same time, the USSR had already soft landed in probably 66 and started prowling around. So they were really getting with it here, and were on the moon. The first flyby of the moon was in 61, I think it was. Luna, I think they called it Luna 1. And it flew by, and I think it was actually in 59 that happened. So it was very early. But in response, getting back to the moon story, in 61, the Soviets flew Yuri Gagarin as the first man to go into space. Of course, the U.S. is going crazy. What do we do now? And they start working on it really hard. And you may remember JFK making that speech about going to the moon. That before the decade is out, we're gonna make it to the moon. And it basically says we don't do these things because they're easy, it's because they're hard, very hard to do. The amount of research and effort it took in 8 years to go from no man in space to putting somebody on the moon is really quite amazing. Apparently there were 500,000 to 750,000 people working for NASA or for the moon race to make that happen. So much was experimented with, researched and learned, and just so much packed into that 8 years to make this happen. One thing, remember too, as I said, the Russians are going along doing this thing too. They weren't sitting around in their hands for certain. Well, there was one of the things that put them behind was an extreme explosion by one of the Russian rockets. And this rocket they built was extremely complicated. And it held something like 30 engines on it or something. They were small, so they thought, well, we'll just pack a whole bunch of them together, and that would be their rocket. It was a monster rocket. And they decided to do a one-off test where they put the whole, generally what you do in these rocket stages is you would set off each one separately to see if it'd work. They decided to put it all together and fire it off, blew up everything, killed scientists. It definitely put them behind, and it wasn't their only catastrophic failure. So the U.S., in this whole process of starting with Mercury, it's a pretty small rocket compared to what was eventually built. It was really a missile rocket for the Mercury program, and they blew up a lot of those, and others trying to learn how to get these rockets to work. And but finally, it culminated in the Saturn V, the biggest rocket ever built. And from what I understand, there were about 33 of these rockets that were built, and not one of them failed. Not one of them, which is really amazing. And of course, that's what got us to the moon, starting with Apollo 8, where they went around the moon in rehearsal. And finally we get to Apollo 11, and the big deal of the first man on the moon, the first men, were Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. And Michael Collins is their commander stayed up in the orbiting command ship. And what an incredible moment that was. In only 8 years, they put those guys on the moon. And it was a dangerous endeavor. 3 astronauts were killed in the Apollo 1, I think it is. Grissom, Chaffee, and White were killed in that. And they sadly enough learned a lot. They learned that they probably never would have gotten to the moon. They had to rebuild the Apollo capsule. Not breathe pure oxygen atmosphere, because it's so dangerous to do that. Anything will burn in a pure oxygen atmosphere. And so anyway, finally with Apollo 11, they got these 2 guys down on the surface. And also it was a really hairy last few minutes. They started having freezing fuel lines, running low on fuel. Their computer that they had, which is what was less than what's in this watch, were getting overloaded. And really, Neil Armstrong ended up manually flying the lunar lander, and flying to a spot that looked good and landing. And I think that's wild that he did that. They were down to 15, 17 seconds of fuel. They would have had to have punched the escape rocket and gone back up to command ship and gone back home without success. In fact, many of these scientists with NASA were pretty convinced that they were going to abort 11 landing somewhere along the line simply because something would fail and they would have to. But it didn't. Everything worked nearly perfectly. And they were able to land, as you know, all that history, and get out and traipse around on the moon and pick up a couple rocks. Now, interestingly enough, I think it's called Luna 12 by the Russians, had timed on purpose, I don't know, to send up a robot, a lunar lander, I think the Luna 12, as I said, and they landed it, they were going to land it on the moon and pick up a scoop of whatever they could scoop up, drop it in a container, take off, come back to the Earth, and be the first ones to bring something to the moon back. Well, this was going on, this orbiting, landing Luna 12, the exact same time that Apollo 11 was in the process of landing on the moon. But apparently the Luna 12 crashed into the moon, so that project failed. Unfortunately, ours didn't. And 3 astronauts came back safely with the great history of the first man on the moon, which was a huge deal. Those when those 3 astronauts came back, they went around the world visiting people in a celebration. I would say they were celebrating as the world celebrates, that man had made it to the moon, and that wasn't just Americans, but us, the world, had made it. I thought that was kind of neat the way they handled that. But it was more than they expected. They were just mega stars, these guys. And Armstrong apparently was the first man on the moon was pretty humble and humbled by it. And because he said there were, you know, how many people, 500,000 or more, that actually got him on that moon, and he understood that, and he didn't want all that praise on him. I wanted praise on everybody that got him there. So anyway, there's a huge amount of history involved in this story of going to the moon, and the last Apollo mission 17, the last man on the moon was Gene Cernan, and just to give you an idea, and it was within just a few years, and then the program is over, and NASA was probably just a shell of once it was. And of course, it went into the shuttle program after that. But now we're back here again, talking seriously about going to the moon, and this time with private companies funding it, which would be a fascinating thing to see. Now they say they've found water on the moon, and that's a big deal, because that would actually allow you to make fuels and stay there. We'll see. Maybe in the near future. So it's been quite a story. Like and comment on my videos, subscribe to my channel, support it. Thanks a lot. Get out there and have a great day.